Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's segment on agroforestry. So this is our last actual content video that we'll be doing. Next week is our moving forward / wrap up video, so that we'll kind of go over everything that we've talked about this summer, which has been a lot of different topics. I know every time I talk to Jeff about these videos, it's just like we're trying to put so much information into an hour-long kind of segment here. So I feel like agroforestry is almost a good wrap up to a lot of the content that we've talked about too. I mean, agroforestry combines, like grazing, cropping, and kind of that long-term sustainability goal that we've set from the very beginning of this segment. So, Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of why agroforestry?
Well, it culminates in, like you said, a lot of concepts. It's very holistic. It's very sustainable when you think about it. And for me personally, it sort of speaks to the future as to where I think agriculture needs to go, more perennial based, um, more like a West Jackson prairie based, a system that sustains itself, and how can we plug ourselves back in?
Right, absolutely. Um, I can think about kind of my first impression of agroforestry. I was just doing like some research back in high school. I don't even know what I was looking up, but I had come across an article of a farmer doing agroforestry, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I can just think about like coming across that, and it's just kind of like, how do they do that? It was just, so many questions came to my mind when I first saw that. And kind of realizing later on, I've been participating in agroforestry from a very young age. We had, maple syrup at our house when I was growing up, so I've always kind of been engaged that way. Can you kind of think about one of your first experiences, you know, confronting agroforestry?
Well, I mean, I always had interest in sort of forest food crops, but the most striking memory I had was when I was traveling in Russia with the Soviet exchange. It was during when the Soviet Union was still there, and in a town called Pushchina, south of Moscow, and it was during Glasnost when all the market shelves were empty. And they hosted us. We were a group from Little Rock, Arkansas, and they fed us very well every day, but 90% of what was put down in front of me, I had no idea what it was.
Wow.
And so I used to know Russian fairly well, and so I started asking the people who were serving us, and I said, where's this food from? And it came out that 90% of the food we ate came from the forest.
Wow.
So
That's awesome.
yeah.
That is a really cool experience. I mean, even just thinking back to the origins of, food and agriculture and people, it comes down to the forest.
It does, yeah.
So,
And the hunter-gatherer thing, I don't think will ever leave us.
right.
And maybe we need to return there someday.
Yeah, absolutely. So if this, hasn't interested you yet, later on we'll be talking about a lot of different topics. So like I mentioned, we'll go over kind of like maple syrup collection. We will talk about mushroom cultivation and foraging. We're going to talk about a little bit of like native plant collection. We're going to talk about like silvopastures and a lot of different systems like that. So we have a lot to cover this video, and I'm excited to share it with you all. If you haven't yet, please like our video and subscribe to our channel. And, make sure that you schedule to tune in next week for our wrap-up video. If we want to ask you all to kind of think about questions from past videos that we've had that maybe you were unable to watch at 4 o'clock and ask a question that came to your mind. Think about that, and we want to hear from you. What are those questions? So next week at 4 o'clock, if you're able to tune in and ask us in our live chat what those questions are, we would love to answer them. If you're not able to tune in, we're going to have something on Facebook and Instagram where you can submit those questions as well. So if you're not able to tune in, you can do it throughout the week. Keep thinking about those questions so that we can answer them for you. So I'm going to go ahead and skip the schedule. Like I said, we're going to have our wrap-up video next Thursday at 4 o'clock, just like all of our videos are. And is there anything you'd want to add about agroforestry before we jump into our kind of like content video?
Well, just keep in mind as we throw these ideas out to you that our own creativity and our own imagination is what's limiting us the most and what's possible in an agroforestry reality. So don't take what you're going to receive as sort of like the end all. It's the beginning all. And there's a lot of opportunity in an agroforestry environment.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we'll just jump right into our video.
All right,
Well, my name's Jeff Dickinson, and welcome to our continued series on Beginning Farmers Collaborative topic of regenerative agriculture. And today's topic is agroforestry, a topic that's near and dear to me. It's one I've been following most of my life. Here at Stratford, I see it as one of the final great pieces that I would like to focus a lot of attention on and make that concept more popular amongst the public. Agroforestry, what do we mean by that? Quite simply, agriculture and forestry and the relationships that agriculture and forest have with each other. And all the sort of permutations you can think of from a creative point of view and from a biological point of view, ecological point of view, of the relationships that you can create to actually create a product or raise livestock, grow a crop. There's so many opportunities, so many permutations you can come up with as you think of the concept of agroforestry. I first was introduced to it through a book that I ran across as a kid. J. Russell Smith. It's called Tree Cropping. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. And he has a subtitle. It's called A Permanent Agriculture. And I think actually J. Russell Smith was a precursor to permaculture that we have mentioned a few times in this series. And so trees are very much a part of Mollison's design, but J. Russell Smith, he spoke more about the culture of trees within natural settings and in more domesticated settings for the production primarily of fruits and nuts, and nuts being the biggest part. And the sort of the stories that sort of wrap around the production of nuts from forest canopy. So I thought it'd be good to just start right here at the sugar shack, because it's probably the most obvious example we've got here at Stratford on what agroforestry means. We actually, in what we call the sugar bush. The sugar bush is an area around us that has a lot of maple trees, sugar maples primarily, but black maples and red maples can also be used. But the sugar shack and sugaring, which is a season that normally happens during the middle of February to the end of March type season. It could be 6 to 8, maybe even 10 weeks sometimes. And sugaring is about collecting sap from trees that starts to run in the spring, and to actually collect it and bring it to a sugar shack with an evaporator inside, and we cook it down. It's about 1 to 2% sugar in that sap that we cook to syrup, and we have to cook down 40 gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of syrup. And a lot of the products, as we go through and talk about what's possible here, take that kind of effort and work, and these are long-term projects that have some short-term gains on an annual basis. So it's a great opportunity to discuss things in here in Stratford's Woods, and we're going to take a walk around and see what else we could be doing in terms of preparing an area for potential crops or potential grazing too, and what we can be introducing into these. And then we're going to talk about what's possible about taking the trees out into the fields, into the open areas, and the relationship we can actually have with cropping systems out in open areas. So let's go check out our next place. Okay, so here we are. One of our stops is actually on our hush trail. It's in our forest, and it's interesting that nature already is giving to us. We used to be a civilization of hunters and gatherers, and most of the gathering actually happened in forest. When we started this shot and was panned over to me, we actually got a close-up of some black walnuts. And as the camera came down and around towards me, you notice that all of a sudden the canopy disappeared, and we're in the middle of this thicket that's all around us. And but even within the thicket, you know, we have crops again that are already here. We're actually in a fairly shady area. This is a black raspberry, and black raspberries typically like to start along the margins of forests, between the forests and the fields, and they're very prolific there. It's been another good season for black raspberries. So Mother Nature's always giving, and It's we actually on the walk here we passed our little pawpaw patch, and we'll talk about more of them later in this video. But when you consider agroforestry, you have to take into consideration the fact that this forest that we're in right now is not very old. All of this in the early 1900s was completely removed. There's been remnants of an apple orchard in here. There's actually volunteer apples that are growing up through here. And it's that history of clear cutting. There have been grazing in here. There's been cropland. I got aerial photographs from the 30s that show this totally denuded. And so what's happened in here has happened over the last 100 years. And it's amazing how succession happens in modern day times, because typically what happens is natural succession sort of maintains its own spacing and density with its own native species. But us silly humans, we brought a lot of the things into the system that actually are very prolific and survive easier than what our forest systems can do. So here we got grapevine, we got honeysuckle, we got mulberry, we got multiflora rose. Fortunately, we got this beautiful cottonwood behind us here. But this, when we came here 30 years ago, the whole forest was pretty much like this. This is how we started. And so you can't really do much other than sort of gleaning a few things that do happen in here in terms of agricultural production. And the other thing, that if you're going to think about bringing or introducing livestock, and that's a whole other topic we'll get into later, but into these systems, you have to have it somewhat open, but you can actually use livestock to help you clear these areas out. Goats are notorious for being able to clear out areas fairly quick, but it's the kind of thing that if you're not managing it and you're paying close attention to it, you can actually create a lot of damage. So when you get to the point where you start opening things up, and we're going to pan over here to the right a little bit, you can see there's a very different understory starting to develop under here. This is all cleared by hand, and our goal is to clear this entire hillside. In fact, it's a long-term goal of mine to actually offer an agroforestry program where each student would be given an acre of scrub, brushy land that they would clear, do a species inventory of what's in here, what's growing well already, and then actually redesign with sustainable principles a forest understory and canopy that could be sustained, for centuries. So you'll actually see on the large tree that is back there, there's a big orange dot on it. That's one of our large maple trees. So we're still in the sugar bush. Our sugar bush is about 280 trees, and so it's this area we just looked at is just right for things like ginseng, black cohosh, golden seal, and for producing high-end horticultural crops, even some other medicinal herbal type crops that reside well within the woods, and do so with ways you can harvest, not impact the woods, and actually be part of your diverse income or enterprise system within a whole farming system. So it's a beautiful process over time. Again, this is a very young forest. On the other end of the property, we have our nature preserve, which is a little older, a little more protected by the fact that it was part of a swamp in a wetland. So opportunities start with knowing the history and thinking about where it's been and where you want to go with the crops that you want to sort of introduce. All right, let's keep moving here. Okay, well, we had to stop at this point along the Hush Trail just to, again, show you some interesting things. We're coming up out of a ravine that obviously is very well protected by the vegetation that's here. But as you can see, honeysuckle is the predominant species in here. We're actually in a canopy that's completely umbrellaed over by honeysuckle. And this side of the hill it was actually the site of an orchard that existed in the early 20th century. I think it existed all the way up in the 40s or 50s maybe. And what's interesting is all those trees that were planted and left and abandoned, probably grazed around and cropped around, continue to grow. I mean, they continue to provide food for the community members here over the years. So all those apples that hit the ground, those trees are all gone. The apples don't typically have a long life, but most of those trees, if not all of them, are gone. And every apple that they dropped in their final days had a seed that actually sprouted and grew on its own. And what's interesting about that concept is every seedling, apple seedling, that comes off of a tree that was originally hybridized and grafted and rooted on a different rootstock, what comes off of the offspring of that tree is a different cultivar, essentially. And so there's potentially trees in here that have flavors and qualities to them that nobody's ever tasted before. So like right here, this is a remnant of an apple tree. It's actually off of a broken branch of the tree that's more above me. And you can actually, a lot of the horizontal diagonal trees that are up through here are actually apple trees that were sort of choked out by the honeysuckle, which is towering above me here to create this umbrella. So as we come in here in the future years, I would love the concept again of having students come in here, learn how to remove invasives, respectfully from the forest, and actually try to save some of these new cultivars that have actually sprouted up through this entire area, and actually sort of create the idea of wild apple jelly or something like that. So it's just interesting, again, the collision of our invasive species with the native plants and what can happen. So let's continue on up the trail. Well, we had to stop here to see the bees within the forest canopy. We actually have quite a few hives that are associated to forest edge lines. We actually have some hives that are actually in the forest. And it's not a bad concept in general. It's actually great for winter protection. But the problem in the winter is also the sun has the opportunity to warm the hives up too, so because the leaves are all down. So, and within the forest canopy, you can actually get some breakdown or cut down of the wood, of the winds that come through here. This is south facing right now. That's to our north, and so the northern winds from the winter will be protected from the hives from these trees that are here with us right now. So there's a few other things that we probably should have covered while we were in the forest, because we're getting ready to transition to agroforestry in farm fields. And just a few things I want to mention is, one is within the forest canopy also is potential for mushroom production, shiitake mushrooms, oyster mushrooms. I mean, there's so many different cultivars that you can actually do in cultivation in the forest. And then if you're a good wild mushroom botanizer, or I guess it's mycologist, I should say, it would be another opportunity to actually, if you know what you're doing, to collect wild mushrooms from the forest and actually make it an economic enterprise. So when we start at the Sugar Shack, a lot of mushroom production actually requires water. So as you think about putting mushrooms into the forest system, think about your access to water and the need for water to sort of maintain the incubation periods for establishing your cultures. So, okay, so we're actually, bees are livestock in our minds here, and we're going to go ahead and get another advantage or view of what agroforestry can look like from a field perspective. But keep in mind that grazing animals within the forest is an option in my mind. Now, a lot of foresters would say it's not an option at all. And for me, it always comes down to the management of the livestock within the forest. And you got to be very certain about your goals. Now, I'm big on using goats and even sheep. I've even used some hogs to clear areas out that are overgrown like we just saw. But if you're going to graze it on a regular basis, high management, and the other thing you keep in mind is, what are they going to be grazing? Most livestock are at least slight browsers. Browsers meaning they're taking leaves off of shrubs and trees. Goats are probably the heaviest browsers. Llamas, which we have here, are heavy browsers also. So if you're going to be browsing leaves, I would agree that there's only so much trees like that. So what are they going to eat? So another enterprise that's worth noting here in agroforestry is the idea of keeping hogs in a forest setting and feeding them nuts. Basically, what comes down from the hickories and the walnuts and the chestnut, if you got it, are great food for hogs and for raising hogs. In fact, it's a specialty item in Europe. And I don't know if anyone in the United States does it, but if not, there's an opportunity for you. So, all right, let's set up the hill a little bit and let's start talking about agroforestry in the fields. Okay, we stopped up here on what I call the spoils of the pond. We're on the north side of the pond, and I wanted to point out a project across the pond. If you see some trees behind the pavilion there and the campfire in the dock, those are primarily willows and catalpa. And we're actually in a great relationship with the Columbus Zoo to provide browse for their zoo animals. And lemurs like catalpa, moose love willow. So we grow it for them, and they come out and harvest it and then process it. And so they can provide fresh native vegetation to their zoo animals instead of a grain-based or a hay-based diet. So what's interesting about how we set up that system is it's very similar to what other agroforestry involved people get into, and that is what I call sort of more of a plantation style of planting trees and setting up rows that you can either crop between or graze between. And you could do high value crops, you can do long-term crops, you can actually hay between them if you set your spacing right. So again, we go back to the whole farm planning idea. It's setting your intentions, setting your goals, making sure what it is you're going for, and then you can plant trees in an area around you that sort of meets those goals. So here on top of this hill here, you can see our grid of bluebird boxes and tree swallows, which to the left is our prairie. But you see these rows over here of catalpa, and we have actually some what I call butternut, and it's a walnut tree, and it's a tree I hate to take down because I love nuts. But so these are grown for the zoo, but you can actually grow these in a way that represent an economic enterprise for your farm. And then, again, talking about grazing around trees, livestock. We don't have any cattle in here now. They're on the other side of the farm. But one of the challenges I've had is over the years, I've tried to plant trees along a fence line to create shade. This is looking north, so you can imagine trees planted along this fence line right here could, over the long term, provide shade for the animals during the summer months, which is critical, especially with the heat like we've had here lately. So that's a long-term process. So the challenge to the agroforester is how to plant and protect a tree long-term in an area that is highly maintained. We have to maintain the heat on that fence. We have to actually trim around it. And myself and our volunteers and interns that I've had over the years, we, one way or another, find a way to clip one, so, and chop it down. So you got to protect those trees. So I started coming up with concepts of pulling them further back on the other side of the lane in hopes that the tree ultimately will, create shade for the pasture. Another tree crop I should mention, as we're over here looking at this corner here, those are black locust post. And we have black locust in our forest. It was a heavily used tree product for construction, primarily fences, but it has also other uses. We use it for raised beds here at Stratford, and the reason we love it is that it'll outlive any treated lumber that you can buy. We actually have posts in the forest that are over 70 years old, from a fence line from decades ago, and they're just very persistent in nature and very rot resistant. So as you look around the landscape here, you see all the opportunities that could be augmented with trees. I would like to keep pushing that idea here with an agroforestry program at Stratford, and all I need is some strong backs and creative minds, and we could do all this together. So let's head back to the farmstead, and I'll show you a couple other things that are interesting in the agroforestry context. Okay, I couldn't resist but to come over here into our apple orchard and show you one of the more domesticated forms of agroforestry out there. And that's the idea. Our apple orchard is actually in our chicken yard. Or actually the orchard was here first and the chicken yard was introduced. And actually it becomes a great symbiotic or synergistic relationship between the chickens and the apple trees. We actually have our chickens in another yard, which we'll show you later. But here in these apples, we got 10 different varieties of apples for the kids to come through and taste through the season as they mature. And what's great to teach to the kids is they can visually see the relationship between livestock and a horticultural crop of high value in terms of the trees providing shade, protection from predators, food by apple drops, food by being here when the insects emerge to infect our trees. Chickens are there waiting for them, and they're chopping and gobbling them up. And then the chickens give back to the trees too in that relationship. They actually scratch the soil, keep it aerated, keep the water coming in, and they actually provide fertility. And they also, the trees actually appreciate the fact that chickens graze. About half of their diet can be just eating the grass. So I benefit from it also because I don't have to mow the grass as often. Chickens help me do that. And so it's a win-win all the way around. A very positive relationship. Let's go check our other chicken yard out. Okay, we're in our second chicken yard. I rotate chickens between yards and seasons. Sometimes I divide these yards up into half. But similar to the orchard apple relationship, we call the chicken coop here the Pawpaw coop, or we call this the Pawpaw Yard. Instead of a domesticated fruit, we've picked a native fruit that I've learned over the years actually starts and grows very well in full sunlight, even though we typically see it within the canopy of a forest. And you can see there's 3, 4, 5 behind me, 6 actually, and new ones in the corner there. These were started 2 years ago as trees about 6 inches tall, and we protected them. We had a different, tighter mesh on them when we started them, and we grew these up to create a similar situation I talked about in the orchard. You know, they'll provide shade, potentially provide food for drops. Of course, we're going to harvest what doesn't drop, and then the chickens and the pawpaws sort of get along and provide things for each other. So the dream is eventually these trees, there's some woods here in Columbus that have trees 20, 25 feet high. And so they have that potential here, so this would be a completely shaded area for the chickens, producing fruit and integrating livestock within a forest type species and system. So that's pretty much what we've got today. Agroforestry is an exciting topic for me, if you can't tell. And I think there's a lot of potential there that we have yet to realize. And I strongly encourage you, as you start to develop and plan your farms, that you think about how forest and trees can be worked in and amongst your horticultural crops, your livestock, or within tree crop products itself, mushrooms, medicinal crops, herbs, fragrances, berries. You know, the list is so long. It's just the only thing limiting is our own imagination. So have fun with the trees, and at the very least, in Japan they call what they call uh, forest bathing. It's an interesting concept. When forest bathing is you take a walk through the forest that's producing all this oxygen, and by just at the very least walk through and take a deep breath of good old O2 that the trees are producing, and enjoy the forest for as much as you can. Have a great day.
All right, so that was our presentation on agroforestry. We talked about a lot. Like I said at the beginning of this video, we had a lot of content to cover, and I think even in the short list that I was kind of talking out, I had missed a couple. So if you are tuned in, I want you to please ask questions in the live chat. Maybe there was a topic or subject that we briefly talked about that you have more questions about. I know a lot of the things that we talked about were things that we're doing or goals that we have in agroforestry at Stratford. So there's definitely a lot of possibilities. To frame our discussion for kind of the next 30 minutes, I wanted to come back to the sustainability piece. I think we've talked about before that it's kind of like environmental, economic, and then social. So starting with kind of the environment aspect of sustainability, agroforestry I think poses an excellent piece in providing for the environment and being an excellent kind of giver there. And so in terms of taking care of the soil, taking care of the native animals and species that exist, kind of what do you have to add to that?
Well, I mean, it's all of these sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture gurus that I've read over the years, the theme is pretty consistent. Mm-hmm. We need to mimic nature as much as we can. Right. And nature does a great job of balancing the perennial production versus the annual production, the seed production to produce those annuals, but also seed production to produce those perennials. Mm-hmm. And it's the mimicking nature in terms of nutrient cycling, in terms of managing pests. It's the predator-prey relationships, the pathogen, the positive organisms that are in our soil ecologies. Right. And in the air and water. So it's that combination of creating a balance that mimics nature that enhances and lends itself to the sustainability of the system.
Sure.
So agroforestry sort of encompasses all that. Mm-hmm. And, it's a wonderful thing to watch.
Yeah. So we kind of talk about this in the video a little bit, but in terms of the environment too, we can see agroforestry being, some challenges arising there. Going too far. What do you kind of see as going too far in agroforestry?
Well, here's the thing: is that we, as a society and as a culture, from both scientific and philosophical point of views, have tended to compartmentalize things and sort of create specialties that always sort of treat these topics as sort of not connected. Mm-hmm. and not interrelated. And so a true forest will look at a cow or a hog in a forest and see the damage that they potentially could create and perhaps even create as soon as they walk in.
Right.
I mean, the hoof action. But again, we learned earlier in our series that hoof action actually can enhance soil ecology. Mm-hmm. But you combine hoof action with an animal actually pulling bark off of a tree, mm-hmm. it's not a desirable thing. And right. Then when you throw a hog into an environment that already has gold and silver ginseng in it, mm-hmm. you want that destroyed. That fact that those species are there is an indication that ecosystem is evolved and mature. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to set it back. There are desirable species. So it comes down to management. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing I learned early on in my career in sustainable ag, is that conventional agriculture is input intensive. Mm-hmm. A lot of those inputs are synthetic or mechanical.
Right.
The contrast with sustainable or regenerative agriculture mm-hmm. is that it's information intensive. That means information on how detailed and complex and interconnected all the biological components are. Mm-hmm. And it's also management intensive.
Yeah.
So the management intensive and the information intensive side of that system have to be part of the sustainability model.
Sure.
Which means you have a strong reverence towards the science that supports what's good management and what's good information.
Right.
So it's a great combination of pieces that you can actually apply and see visually much more in a forest than you can in a cropping or a livestock system by itself. Because in a forest, you actually are seeing multiple components at work daily, year-round.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's kind of the main piece to consider, is that it is all just connected, and we have to kind of acknowledge those relationships from an environmental standpoint, because the environment doesn't act individually, it acts together. And so in agriculture, we should mimic the same thing.
Right.
So kind of looking at that and kind of acknowledging those management challenges, how do you see someone get started? I know we talk about, knowing the history of the land, and I know that we focus a lot on, removing those invasive species. That's kind of one of our main tasks at Stratford. What kind of recommendations do you have someone that's interested in getting into agroforestry and maybe just has a plot of land?
Well, I mean, there's scale issues and
Right.
sort of how fast and how strong. And I'm always one to sort of to not jump in too quick, too strong.
Yeah.
Don't get into debt.
Yeah.
And sort of learn as you go. It sort of comes with the information base that you're starting with, the knowledge base you're starting with. So things like removing invasives. I mean, if you're going to raise goats and you have invasives you want to manage, we have systems, electric fencing, solar-driven, remotely charged systems that are easy to put up and take down, and start with a small space with a half a dozen goats and watch to the extent those goats can damage the ecosystem.
Right.
And be ready to pull them out. They're very easy to manage. I mean, that's the beauty of small livestock. They're very easy to pull in and out of the system.
Sure.
And then before you even go in with those goats, though, is actually, sure, take inventory of how many invasives are in there, but what are the different species that are there that you will want to save? Right. Not just what you want to get rid of, but what do you want to keep? And that's true with soil, too. There's weeds in the cropping system that can actually be very beneficial.
Right.
Like broom sedge is a grass. Any of the tall grasses or prairie grasses that happen to be natively there in your soils, you would actually early on want to preserve those because they're very beneficial to the system.
Sure.
Or the idea of plants that are beneficial to pollinator insects.
Right.
You want to sort of inventory those plants that are there, like milkweed, and actually consciously decide you're going to keep some of that or all of it.
Right.
So again, it's that whole setting your attentions against that whole farm plan, collect your information, get your management scheme together, set your goals.
Yes.
Okay, I got a Toggenburg goat. I want to milk, but I don't want to feed it hay or grain all the time. I want it to browse, and that's going to enhance the quality of my milk.
Right.
So set your goal about quality milk, low-fat milk, and put it against your system and work it from that scale until you get comfortable, and then think about growing.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny that you mentioned the grazing a goat in the forest. My dad swears that he doesn't get poison ivy because he would drink goat's milk that was grazed on poison ivy. So.
I have friends who would actually go out and grab the first poison ivy leaf and eat it as an immune system response, to protect themselves. Yeah. And apparently it works, but this guy never got poison.
That's funny. Yeah, I know when we raised goats back home, we would use the electronet system and just like put a square, and then after a week or so, once we noticed they had kind of gone through what they wanted, just turn it over, and just move down the line, kind of on the edge of the forest where we wanted to.
Yeah.
So we've got kind of a few different questions here. The first one is to talk about fungi, and then the second one we'll get to after we talk about that. So, in our video we had a couple different setups for mushroom production. And so one of the first and not easier ones is to produce it yourself. You can always forage for mushrooms, but then you kind of run the risk of, harvesting something you might not want. We were talking about before we went live that there's the mushroom that's good to eat, and then the mushroom that looks exactly alike, but is, poisonous or something. So we kind of focus on this mushroom production and using logs as a way to like inoculate these logs and then produce the mushrooms. Do you want to talk about kind of your experience with that?
Well, what's neat about logs and the fact that they can actually stabilize an environment for fungus production,
Mm-hmm.
but the question I see here is sort of more related to mycorrhizal fungi,
Yeah.
and which is an incredible nutrient cycling feature within forest systems.
Mm-hmm.
And for years, we used to think that mycorrhizal fungi never existed within cropping fields.
Mm-hmm.
And we're finding out more and more they do, but the correlation is strongly between the relationship of that field with the forest.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that if you introduce wood, like hugelkultur. Did we talk about hugelkultur, Annie?
I think so.
It's just sort of the foundation of you're building of beds with lots of rotting wood underneath, and then compost and topsoil,
Yeah.
and you build it up, and manure, raw manure is even part of the equation there.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that you have this wood in there that mycorrhizal fungi are attracted to cellulose, basically,
Okay.
and the ability of trees to send cellulose through the roots
Mm-hmm.
into the soil system that helps to transmit their system through the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important in a lot of phosphorus transfer in the nutrient cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So when we build beds, we actually use wood to build the bed, either as a perimeter, and then we actually have purposely put logs in the bed
Mm-hmm.
that are decaying that promote mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay.
So what we have found is mycorrhiza actually exists in what we call patch dynamics in soil ecosystems.
Okay.
So they're like pockets, and all these pockets actually have the ability to communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if they exchange nutrients, but they actually sort of react and communicate with each other.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the mycorrhizal fungi, and our ability to bring them into our cropping systems, into our agroforestry systems is an important component.
Sure.
But the beauty of wood and mushroom production in general is the ability, because it's a fairly uniform media,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very slow in its nutrient transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And fungus and mushrooms in general like that slow feed.
Yeah.
They don't like the quick feed. That's
Mm-hmm.
where you get into the sort of the competitors of mushrooms in a mushroom system.
Yeah.
And that's where the very specialized, the morels, come out of very specific soil conditions.
Mm-hmm.
That it's like a black box we have yet to totally figure out.
Yeah.
To a point we can't really reproduce the ability to produce morels without going out in nature and harvesting them.
Yeah.
From what nature is like.
Yeah. Yeah, as we're talking about the mycorrhizal fungi, there was a documentary a couple months ago that came out. I wish I could remember the name of it.
I wish I'd seen it. Yeah, I heard it was wonderful. Yeah.
And just picturing kind of the webs that exist under the ground.
Yeah.
They had some beautiful like imagery that really helps you kind of like understand the mycorrhizal system that exists just like all over the world.
Yeah.
And even just like continuing to connect that with soil is that I know some farmers, they'll almost like inoculate their soil with different things, like kind of similar to what you were talking about. I know a farmer that'll actually put mycelium blocks in his compost to kind of reintroduce things like that into the soil for other plants to use.
And actually, a lot of the biodynamic treatments, the biotreatments, I forget what they call them, biological treatments, biotreatments, preps.
Yeah.
Prep 101, they were based on its ability to enhance sort of microbial activity in the soil.
Yeah, it's super important to have your soil that's alive.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of the main focuses, I feel like, of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I mean, living soils.
Right.
And living in the soil context is very inclusive large variety of organisms.
Mm-hmm. So our next question is from Kent. Kent wants to know what the time frame is for seeing results from agroforestry. So this was kind of like the next segment of the sustainability triangle, is that the economic piece. So one of the biggest challenges in the economics of agroforestry is that it can be slow getting started. You have to wait a while to see the results, at least from the wood, like the forest piece.
So here's the thing: the beauty of agroforestry in a time scale sense is that yes, you have initial input cost, but typically it's seeds. You can do direct seeding of nuts and things like that, or plants, tree seedlings.
Yeah.
And of course the labor.
Yeah.
But if you spatially design it, so you could do things in between those trees while you're waiting for 50 years to harvest a veneer walnut log, your input costs actually drop dramatically. And so basically what you're left, if you did nothing else in between those trees, then the input costs continue to go up over the years. But if you're actually cropping and harvesting between those trees while you're waiting for the final, or I wouldn't say final harvest, a sustainable harvest of trees, veneer logs. It's a veneer log. In my day when I used to price it, one good black walnut log would bring you $50,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So you sort of selectively pick those logs out. The idea you're replacing them over time. You've got a succession of trees that are moving through the system. But you're doing other high economic output and low economic input type systems.
Right.
Like ginseng, once it's established, again, it becomes a sustainable harvest.
Right.
You never take it all. You're selectively harvesting the most mature plants in a group or community of ginseng. So that the ginseng's always reproducing itself. So there's a lot of opportunity to have economic gains while you're waiting for the long-term gains. So again, it's not just biodiversity, but it's economic diversity that lends itself to economic sustainability.
Absolutely. I know you talk about ginseng, and it makes me think about United Plant Savers. One of their biggest missions is protecting ginseng. And so, similar to like mushroom harvests, when, ginseng comes up, a lot of people will go and actually harvest it, but they'll overharvest because it's a lot of different people coming to the same land. And then, areas are just completely void of ginseng in the years to come because of that. And so that is another really valuable, crop that you can have in an agroforestry system that is really valuable. And kind of continuing off of that, once, you continue to make these investments, agroforestry is a really diverse system. And so you are constantly being able to take from and, economically profit from year round, because there's just so many different avenues of production in this system in a lot of different ways over time. So I think that's one of the main advantages of it, or why that investment is valuable from the start.
It is, and human savvy sort of plays heavily in this because I love growing like hazelnuts, for instance, one of my favorite crops. But squirrels have a way of getting there right when they're ready. If you're not ready to stop them or get them before they do, don't take it all.
Yeah.
So you got to be nimble.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Or I've definitely even seen, doing some research for this video, I had found some like hazelnut finished hogs, or like acorn finished hogs, and that just sounds super awesome. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a high value market, in Europe, and I'm not aware of anyone in the United States that's really capitalized on that. I have one person I know that used to be an intern at Stratford.
Really?
Yeah. Bobby Sanswich. She was an intern. I don't know what her married name is now, but I follow her on Facebook, and she's doing some hog production in the woods, and I'm sure she's taking advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I at the beginning of the summer there was a Zoom that I had tuned into, and someone was doing hog production in the forest.
Yeah.
I can't remember the farmer, his name, but it's definitely really valuable, and there's a demand for it.
There
really
is,
high
yeah.
price, yeah.
I mean, and if anybody's experienced, which I haven't, but all the accounts I've heard is like, wow, it's pretty good stuff.
Sure. So our next question has to do with lumber. So the question is, don't forests need to produce our society lumber? What is sustainable forestry?
Sustainable forestry means a long-term plan over a large amount of acreage. I mean, it's the idea that clear cutting, to me, is something from the past, and it may have its place in time as our development continues to move forward, march forward. But sustainable forest management, or sustainable harvesting, is a concept that basically limits the amount of harvest against an abundant input of both seeds and seedlings and habitat management, maintenance, keeping the invasives out.
Yeah.
And so it's not a concept that was designed to make anybody rich quick.
Yeah.
It's designed to create a steady income over time that is not avarice, or it's not greedy.
Yeah.
Basically. So let's see. There's another aspect to that question. Yes, society's lumber. Okay. So here's the big, the recycling market,
Yeah.
all over the place.
Right.
And we have so much technology and so much ability that within the pulp field itself, combined with recycling, with what pulp and paper and just in wood products that are thrown in the landfill every day, if we just had the mindset that we have harvested enough pulp to make all the toilet paper we need already,
Yeah.
and just keep reusing it,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have to harvest another tree for pulp.
Yeah.
Now, for building, that's a whole other technology too, because we create another large amount of waste in plastic. And here we have the ability to take large amounts of pulp, large amounts of plastic, and combine them to make a wood that doesn't rot.
Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, they're actually using their plastics and pulp to make permanent bike paths and permanent roads.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunity that, again, our creativity and our own imagination has missed the opportunity to capitalize on. And I say capitalize as in capitalism.
Right. Yeah.
There is so much opportunity out there that we could take advantage of that we just throw away.
Yeah.
We just throw away. I mean, coal is another great example.
Yeah.
If we truly valued coal for what it was, we wouldn't use it to burn it,
Yeah.
or to create heat, or to create energy.
Yeah.
We would use it to make carbon fibered products.
Yeah.
Did you ever play a carbon fibered guitar?
I have not, but you've talked about it before.
It never goes out of tune.
Yeah.
It never warps.
beautiful
resonating instrument that will be here for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So, and that's just the beginning of what carbon can do in today's technology.
Right.
High technology will.
Yeah. Yeah. I know you had mentioned the carbon fiber guitar, and my mind went to the carbon fiber pole vault pole.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, and it's another kind of funny thing you mentioned. Paper pulp is. I'm from Chillicothe. We have a paper mill, right there. Uh-huh. So you're constantly all of the chemical inputs that go into breaking down the wood to make the paper is crazy.
Yeah.
And I went to a money making factory actually in Massachusetts about a year ago, and they actually use leftover cotton from clothing making. So they use just like cotton waste to then make paper.
Yeah.
And so why don't we do that for real paper? Why are we using trees instead of a leftover product? I don't know.
It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And here's the other flip side is that, again, the paper pulp demand could be met quite easily with just well-managed, sustainably harvested, again, softwood, plantation style production. It's a confined area, in and out, but, all the waste that's going on otherwise, we don't even think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to kind of create this time for you to talk about what you had mentioned at the beginning of the video. You were talking about kind of your vision for, having like agroforestry interns, coming and having an opportunity to shape the land in their own way. Well, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, and that's I would like to see that as sort of like a capping piece for the organization. For my role there is in an agroforestry program, have these students, college age students who are into forestry or into resource management, come in and actually start an appreciation based through not just looking but interacting with the forest. Essentially, we have 65, 70 acres of overgrown scrub forest on our property still. We have 95 acres of preserve, which we've already removed invasives from, and that's a never-ending project.
Right.
So that's a whole other side. And the agroforestry program would probably have to eventually end up in the preserve to talk about things like sustainable forest management.
Right.
But in the areas that are scrubbed, I don't know, did you throw the slide in about the denuded land in the 30s?
Yeah, that picture,
early on. So you saw that picture, and then what the forest you saw there came after that. So, and as a result of that practice and that management scheme, we're basically 70, 80% invasives. To give every student like an acre.
Yeah.
If it's a popular program, half acre, or a quarter an acre, depends on how big the program is. I want to get it done in my lifetime, basically,
Yeah.
And basically remove the invasives, but not remove them by slash and burn or heavy use of herbicides or bring the bulldozer in, There are sustainable ways to work on the land without compacting soil, destroying habitat, and basically removing invasives. And there's ways to sort of dispose of them or use them, hugelkultur again.
Yeah.
Especially as we move into this environment of being the new subtropics of North America,
Yeah.
We need to raise our crops out of the ground.
Yeah.
So, and then inventory what's left of the native species. Again, we're going to focus on mimicking nature. The forest that's there was developed over millennium, and inventory, appreciate what's there, and then design within the soils and the vegetation, the diversity, the habitat that's there, the slope that's there, the soil quality that's there. Design a system that could be planted either by seed or transplants, and put into a scheme that basically was a management model for 100 years or more.
Yeah.
Forever.
Right.
And think about harvesting that saves the plant, harvesting that takes the plant, harvesting that feeds the soil, harvesting that feeds us, and for everything we take, it's being replaced by either through management or augmentation, and a greater appreciation or sense of what this space or spot can do.
Yeah.
And react to nature as if we are part of nature ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like an awesome program. So I hope you enjoyed this segment on agroforestry. As you can tell, there's obviously a lot of different opportunities and different time frames of ways to get started in agroforestry. And it sounds like an awesome way to be environmentally focused and economically focused in a long-term sense. And so just a reminder, if you haven't yet, like our video and subscribe to our channel. And next week will be our wrap-up. So we'll kind of, talk about all of the subjects that we've gone through this entire summer, which I cannot believe it's, already
over.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we'll have, if you weren't able to, ask these questions today, we'll have somewhere on our social media where you can submit those questions and we'll answer them next week, and kind of just wrap up everything to get kind of a brief overview of everything we've gone over. So thanks for tuning in and have a good night.